Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at the astrological chart of Jimi Hendrix. And Jimi Hendrix was born November 27th, 1942 in Seattle, Washington. And of course, he is a legendary guitarist, one of the greatest of all time, not just sheer talent, but also the way that he performed. And if you have ever seen some of his performances at Monterey Festival, for instance, it's like mesmerizing. I think I would recommend anyone who has heard of him, but maybe not really watched anything that he's done to check that out. I'm sure it's still on YouTube because I saw it not too long ago, within the last couple of years. So when I was in high school in the early 80s, there was the classic rock genre on FM radio coming into its own. FM radio had been a thing for over a decade, but the classic part of it. And so those acts from the 60s were considered classic rock. But what is so freaky is that, when I think about like 1981, for instance, or 1982, and Jimi Hendrix being big, I don't know, maybe 1968, that's what I'm thinking was his big year. Let's just say 67, 68. That was only like 15 years earlier. And I think about now and how generic everything is. 15 years, 20 years, you might not even really know that you're watching a video that's 20 years old sometimes. That's like from 2005, from the time that I'm recording this in 2025. I mean, I have looked at videos and I have no idea when, what exact year it was, if I don't have any other markers, because it just the way people look is not as markedly different as it was in the 60s, 70s, and so on and so forth, and 80s. So that 15 years from when I was first listening to him in the early 80s and when he was doing his thing, it was quite a span of time, because so much had changed in the interim. And yet, and actually those kinds of songs or bands, Jimi Hendrix, Cream, all of those, like more on the heavy side, those kinds of acts were not really things that I was into, but I remember how he did All Along the Watchtower, and what an amazing cover that is. I mean, from Bob Dylan's song. And it's definitely up there as one of the greatest cover songs in history, in rock history. And so Jimi was a Sagittarian, and I'm a Sagittarian, and he really had that kind of Sag vibe to him. And so when I was plugging in the information, I was thinking to myself, I bet he has Sagittarius rising. It just like came into my mind, and sure enough, I was right. And that's because the rising sign can be, the appearance of someone, and his look, which he said he got from Bob Dylan, by the way, is so iconic. And Prince, I think he took from Jimi Hendrix his dressing style, but then also a little bit of Little Richard and the moves of James Brown and that kind of thing. So, people get inspired by other people, and that's fine. But I think everyone, when they, because he died so young, Jimi Hendrix, he was only 27 years old. It's like he's frozen in time. And so the clothing that he was wearing is what we think of him. Like, what would he look like today if he were still alive? It really is an interesting question. But so I'm going to go into his inner planets and along with the rising sign and kind of like get a feel for what his core personality traits might have been like, and then go through some of the houses to look at different influences. He doesn't have any, oh no, he does have Uranus in the fifth house, which is the house of creativity, and he has Venus in the 12th house. So I'll talk about that because those two houses, I think, are specifically connected with creativity. The fifth house for sure, but I think the 12th house also. And also his spiritual side, because I don't really know much about him as an individual and kind of the things he was into, but I remember reading some material. It was, I don't know, it might have been a book. I can't remember if it was a book or if it was online, but it was something about this woman who had been his girlfriend. And I want to say her name was Ingrid, but that might not be right, but I think she was Swedish. And she was saying that he was murdered, that he wasn't actually, that he didn't just die of a drug overdose or whatever they said he died of, because I think they said something like that. And so I'm going to look at the eighth house, because the eighth house is the house of death. I mean, the fourth house can be connected to the way that the person dies, but the eighth house is definitely connected to death. And I'm going to talk about that. And she said that the record company wanted him to the record company wanted him to continue to promote like a druggy image, and he wanted to be spiritual. And he has one of his album covers had Krishna on it, I think. I can't remember the name of that album, but it was, psychedelic, but it had like the Hindu god Krishna on it. And I'm assuming he was into Eastern mysticism, for instance, which was big in the late 60s. But in any case, I've heard interviews with him, and I have been stunned at how elegant this man was in his speaking style. He was not spaced out from what I saw. I mean, there might have been one interview where he might have been high or something like that, but I did hear interviews with him where he was very, you could tell the man was intelligent, very intelligent. So it's funny because I see his Mercury is 2 degrees of Sagittarius and mine is 3 degrees of Sag. So there you go. But yeah, and so I'm gonna discuss that, because I wouldn't put it past anyone to, especially these types of rock stars, because there have been a lot of suspicious deaths, and the record companies, they can make great profits from a dead artist, sometimes more than a living artist. So, and I'm not accusing any particular entity of, killing him or anything, but I'm just saying that sometimes these deaths seem suspicious, and this woman actually said this, and she was with them. So anyway, so Jimi had the sun in Sagittarius, his moon in Cancer, where, Sag and Cancer forming in conjunction. But this is an example, which is a hard angle, but it's it's 150 degrees apart. Very weird combination when you have two signs that form in conjunctions, but in his case, the degrees really mattered because his sun was at 4 degrees and his moon of Sag, and his moon was 28 degrees of Cancer. So they actually form a trine, his sun and moon. And the reason for this is that his moon was at a late degree of Cancer, so it was close enough to Leo, and his sun is in early degrees of Sag. So it just goes to show you can't just go by the signs themselves, although I would still maintain that this is kind of weird. Okay. Sagittarians who have moons in Cancer, I'm pretty sure I have a video on this combination, and it must be very difficult for that person because it's just very, very difficult when Sagittarius love freedom so much, and yet the moon in Cancer can be emotionally clingy. So I bet that anybody who has this combination, if anybody listening has this combination, I feel for you, because you might be a little bit confused, about your emotional nature with this sun sign. He had Mercury in Sagittarius. He had Venus in Sagittarius. He had Mars in Cancer, and he had Sagittarius rising. Now, his Jupiter, so his moon and Jupiter were almost the same degree, so they formed a conjunction. And he had a conjunction between his Sun and Mercury and his Sun and Venus. So what did I say? I used the word elegant and I used the word intelligent. His Sun is forming conjunctions with both Mercury and Venus, so it really intensifies or strengthens those contacts between those two planets, and it affects his sun. So that conjunction with Mercury can mean that his sense of self and his ultimate identity is connected to intelligence and also to refinement. And yeah, that was the word when I said elegant, I meant refined. He had a refined quality. And the reason that this is so interesting is because when he was on stage, and I mentioned Monterey, because the funny thing about it is he lit his guitar on fire. And those people in the audience, probably a lot of them are tripping on acid during that performance and the whole day, because probably we're tripping for hours. And there was like this woman who was like, I think she was pretty close up. And it was so funny. If you see her expression, she's just like staring at him like she's freaked out while he's, it was almost like he did this fire ritual, because he kind of like was moving his hands, and it was like, I'm sure he was trying to fan the flames. But Sagittarius is a fire sign. And it's so interesting. So it makes sense that he would do that. Now, Pete Townsend of The Who, that was the first chart I was going to look at. I'm going to do it after this one. And it got me thinking about Jimi Hendrix, because, of course, they were contemporaries. And Pete Townsend is still at it all these years later. But they both were doing things with their guitars. I can't remember I don't think Jimi, I don't know if he ever would just like break the guitar, but Pete Townsend would. I'm trying to remember if that woman was like freaked out about Pete Townsend or Jimi Hendrix, come to think of it. But anyway, I'm going to be doing both of these great guitarists. And one of the things that when we talk about these showmen, we look at the ascendant because that's what people are seeing. Of course, the sun and the moon, these very important elements are going to show up in one way or the other. And to some degree, I consider them interchangeable. There might be slight variations in how they present, but I think that they are basically going to give the same themes. But the rising sign is how people who don't know us, how they, the conclusions they draw of us based on how we're behaving around other people, but also how we're dressed, also how our mannerisms are. So when I talk about Jimi having Sagittarius rising, we're talking about fire, the fire element. And also, he is ruled by, or he was ruled by Jupiter. So, Jupiter, it's like Texas, does everything, everything is a little bit bigger, um, when you talk about Sag rising. And it means that the person can be larger than life. Now, in the case of Elvis and Elton John, it could even be physically, sometimes a person may have weight issues, not necessarily their whole life, but at least at certain points in their life, because of that excessive quality of Jupiter. And the first house, or, and the ascendant is the cusp of that, is the body, or part of it, part of the self. Now, of course, if we got metaphysical about it, we'd say, well, that's not the true self. And that's for sure. Even the sun isn't the true self. But in this lifetime, it really gives an understanding of what the person has come here to express. When somebody has their sun and their rising sign as the same sign, in this case, he doesn't have them in conjunction because they're not close enough in degrees. But he has them in the same sign. There's going to be consistency. And this is really important because sometimes a person kind of like comes across one way, but they're really another way. And for the people around them, this can have either confusing they could have a confusing reaction or an unsettled reaction where they're like, okay, is this person being phony? Like let's say they have a hard angle between their sun and ascendant. They may give off this vibe of being phony, like they're not really authentic. And other people might scratch their heads and say, what's up with that? When in fact, it is a part of them. And if it is inharmonious with the sun sign, you could say it's almost like a defense mechanism, or, a way for them to or a protective device, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, so when I think of Sagittarius rising, and I think of the clothing that the kind of outfits that Jimi wore, it was kind of like the gypsy archetype. Now, I apologize if the word gypsy is considered offensive these days. I think it's such a beautiful word, and I hope that that's not true, but I have read people commenting. The only reason that I'm using it is because, sometimes it's overstated a little bit or exaggerated, so I don't want to just assume that this is the case. But what I mean by that is this idea of the person who, he would wear a headband that was kind of like very, he just had this dressing style that reminded me of somebody who is very free-spirited. And that is certainly what I would describe as Sagittarius. Now, Bob Dylan has Sagittarius rising as well. And he had an album called Freewheeling Bob Dylan. The freewheeling aspect of a person, very spontaneous, very authentic. And so that's how I picture Jimi, with his garb and the way that he carried himself. And yet he had a square between his sun and Chiron. And so that can indicate identity issues. I just looked it up on Wikipedia, and Jimi was black and also had indigenous heritage in the form of Cherokee, Native American. And so sometimes when people have mixed heritage, that can create identity issues. And by the way, identity issues doesn't necessarily mean it's a big deal, but simply that it's hard for the person to really feel like they belong to one group or another, even if we could consider that rather superficial. I mean, I have the same kind of situation, not like him, but in my own way. And I actually feel that it's a good way to transcend labels. But some people, it's problematic, so I don't want to just like make it seem like, okay, well, it's no big deal. Maybe that was why he might have felt that way, because with his moon in Cancer, like Cancer is the sign of home and family and is very connected to genealogy, believe it or not, like the ancestry. So that could be something that where the person really wants to know their roots, but perhaps in some cases it opens up more questions than answers. And that's why I say, just because I have a certain belief about something doesn't mean that it might not have affected somebody like Jimi. And, he was born in Seattle, and I'm assuming he grew up in the Pacific Northwest. And I don't know, like, racially, what that situation was like, if he was, you know, in the vast minority in his classes and whatnot, if they were mostly white kids, who knows? You know, there's no way of knowing, like, exactly what that meant for him. For some people, well, here's another thing that's very interesting. His Chiron is in the 8th house. And so, there may have been hidden reasons for it. The 8th house can be very secretive, can deal with all kinds of subject matters, including sexuality, by the way. And also, this may have a philosophical side to it, come to think about it, because his sun is in the 11th house, but it seems to be pretty close to the 12th. His 12th house was 7 degrees of Sag, and his sun was at 4 degrees. So, it can be when people have Chiron in the 8th house, and he had Pluto. So that is very, very interesting, because I have not read a biography of his, but there was another artist, I can't remember if it was like Elton John, who I have done the chart for, where they had that as well. I don't know about Chiron, but they had Pluto. And what I said in that particular reading for that famous person, whose autobiography, I think it was somebody like Elton John, and I had read a biography on him and an autobiography, and I said, it's hard to know, because I've noticed this before with other celebrities that I've done, where they have had, maybe it was something in the 8th house or the 12th house that was kind of like, wow, did something like majorly like traumatic happen to this person that they did not divulge in their autobiography, because it's showing up here. And yeah, I mean, people can pick and choose what they talk about for sure. And especially if it could, involve somebody that is close to them that they don't want to hurt, or they don't want to hurt the extended members of that person's family. They may not do that. But, it's interesting, because I would say anybody with Chiron in the 8th house is a natural healer, and he has in conjunction with the North Node. And they are both in Leo, 28 and 29 degrees. His Chiron is 29 degrees of Leo, which is this, Leo is a sign of creative self-expression and rules the house of creativity, the 5th house. So, yeah, I mean, it definitely seems that he was destined to be in the entertainment business. But in the 8th house, to me, it's almost like his death was part of his legacy. Like that became, his fame, arose from his death. We think about Janis Joplin. As a matter of fact, I think Jimi and Janis died within weeks of each other. So in 1970? Yeah, I think so, because then Jim Morrison died in 1971. So, yeah, I think Pluto in the 8th house can be some kind of trauma that the person suffered from that might have been quite severe if it was like continual abuse, or maybe it was like this one event that really just kind of transformed that person deeply. So I think there's every chance that he might have been like a healer at some point later on if he would have lived as long. Or maybe even his music was healing to a lot of people. Even though it's not, atypical for the sound is so hard that you would think that it wouldn't be, but it might have been. Another interesting thing was he had Neptune in the 9th house. And this can actually be people who have very profound visions of a spiritual nature, but it could be with particular deities. And the reason this is important is, to me, the 9th house is like organized religion, but this could be like some kind of mystical, to me, Neptune is mystical experiences that are connected with these more of these organized religions. So like I said, he had Krishna on the cover of one of his albums. Maybe he had a vision of Krishna. And so he developed this kind of connection with Krishna. There's always a danger when Neptune is in the 9th house that the person gets deceived or deluded by God, material, or whatever. Because Neptune can be the planet of deception or illusion. And that could even include a spiritual teacher, like a guru that turns out to be like a cult leader. There could be a, kind of being drawn to cults. So therefore, if you have Neptune in the ninth house, you have to practice extreme discernment so that you don't get taken away to la la land spiritually. In the 10th house, he had Mars. This is very scrappy energy. This is like somebody who's really like trying to be famous, which doesn't sound like him. But who knows, you know, sometimes people make it look effortless. And I noticed too that he had some hard angles to to Saturn. Sun opposing Saturn, Mercury opposing Saturn, and Venus opposing Saturn. Venus opposing Saturn can feel unloved growing up. You know, Saturn can be authority figures. And Venus can mean that there's no, there might be coldness coming from parents. And this can carry over. Mars in the 10th can be like, you know, fighting authority figures. So with this with these hard angles to Saturn, that might just be kind of how it went with him. Mercury opposing Saturn, being kind of questioned for beliefs, and maybe like, you know, being overpowered, like somebody saying, no, you know, you have to believe this, and things like that. And the Sun opposing Saturn can be that the person's light, or whatever you want to call it, their self-expression is somehow being restricted. Saturn can be restrictions. So that can just make the person chomping at the bit to really get to this point where they're able to express themselves freely. Venus in the 12th can receive artistic inspirational from the divine. 12th house is karma, you know, past lives. Maybe he was an artist in a past life and he was just carrying it over into this one. But it can be soulmates. I mean, Venus here. But I think, you know, in terms of artistic inspiration, it could be deriving it from spiritual means. Like, for instance, I always think about these writers like James Michener. I think that's who I'm thinking of. And they were oh my God, there are some of these writers who have written dozens of books, and the books are like 1,000 pages long. I'm telling you, man, I think those people are channeling, and they may even be kind of either tapping into the Akashic Records, which like has everything recorded of that, you know, everything that man has ever done is recorded, like it's on a spiritual hard drive. But to just be able to do that, maybe they're engaging in automatic writing and they're just kind of having it pour out of themselves. Who knows? So maybe he was inspired spiritually. And the 5th house, which is the actual house of creativity, he has Uranus here. This Uranian energy. And he actually had, it's interesting, he had the Sun opposing Uranus, Mercury opposing Uranus, and Venus opposing Uranus. The Sun opposing Uranus, I have the square, can be, these are hard angles to Uranus, can be like being rejected for who somebody is. So again, with that Sun square Chiron, this could be painful. Who he was may have been at odds with his environment. And that may have been upsetting to him. Like I say, I mean, you don't underestimate the moon in Cancer for wanting that emotional security. You know, he was super rebellious with all this Sag, but even that can't isn't necessarily enough to override the emotional needs of a moon in Cancer. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. Mercury opposing Uranus, that could be neurodivergent person. That could be somebody, but you know, and the sun even, I think that could even be as well. Somebody who's neurodivergent who, and I think there are a lot of artists, you know, even when we talk about things like dyslexia, that they are, and you will find that, you know, somebody with ADD, dyslexia, that they have artistic gifts. And the way that they think is not linear. And that's because they are creative. And they can't fit into that little box. So, that is actually, that to be can be a superpower. It doesn't have to be, oh my God, you know. And Venus opposing Uranus, I think a lot of that can be the person who might be at odds with the issue of freedom within relationships. And, you know, this is probably because he has the moon in Cancer and Mars in Scorpio. They're both water signs. And they tend to be very emotionally, like Scorpio's emotionally intense. Cancer is emotionally sometimes needy or clingy emotionally. So that might have been like very difficult for him to get a handle on what his emotional needs were. With the Sun and Mercury in the 11th house, he was like the prophet for a generation. I don't know if that, Sag is connected to being the prophet, or how would I put it? When I say prophet, I'm talking about the person who is able to translate the energy of the time and really make people understand what it represents. And I'm not saying he did so in the lectures or anything like that, but just by his very presence, just by his music, it really reflected back on his generation. And, you know, if he were alive now, he might, possibly be a major player on social media. I mean, it almost seems profane to say social media in the context of somebody like Jimi Hendrix, because it just sounds so like shallow as hell. But I do feel like people who have Mercury in the 11th house are kind of have the pulse of the collective. I don't know if that word zeitgeist or something like that, if that kind of describes what I'm talking about. Yeah, I looked it up. And they say the defining spirit or mood of a particular period of history as shown by the ideas and beliefs of the time. And then they have an example, and they said the story captured the zeitgeist of the late 1960s. Well, isn't that synchronistic? And so, Mercury is the articulation of something, of ideas, right? So the 11th is the collective. And so obviously Jimi didn't live long enough to fully realize this, dying in his late 20s as he did, but he still attempted it to some degree, I would say. His midheaven was in Libra. Libra is ruled by Venus, so anything aesthetic, anything that creates beauty in the world, certainly music, would be part of this. In his 7th house of committed partnership, he had the moon and he had Jupiter. I don't know much about his love life, but this suggests a sub-influence of Libra for his moon that was already in Cancer. So that would definitely make somebody who is very comfortable with the idea of commitment and very romantic. Jupiter here is, I think, wanting freedom within the context of relationships. Jupiter's a ruler of Sagittarius, so it has that flavor to the area of partnerships too. So very strong Sagittarian signature. Actually, the 5th house is the house of love, house of creativity too, which can indicate like a bohemian with Uranus here, bohemian expression through one's art, but also it can be like one's attitude towards love. I have this as well, being more freedom loving or unconventional in one's way of loving. Free love in the 60s, that kind of thing. He had a lot of good aspects from different planets to Jupiter. His sun trine Jupiter, his moon formed a conjunction with Jupiter, which I would consider positive. Mercury trining Jupiter and Mars trining Jupiter. Jupiter's the ruler of Sagittarius, but it exerts that positive, expansive influence. So it can give people hopefulness, and if you're in the entertainment field, you might have a lot of rejection that you have to face, and some people give up. They lose confidence in themselves, and this can make it more likely that the person perseveres, that they have positive thinking, with Mercury trining Jupiter. And he also had a lot of nice angles to Neptune. Sun, Moon, Mercury, and Venus all sextiling Neptune. Very good for intuitive pursuits. Also a well-aspected Pluto. Sun trining Pluto. I think that's very good for self-empowerment. The moon in conjunction with Pluto, I wouldn't characterize that as necessarily positive or negative, just kind of like it all depends on the sign it's in and whatnot. I have this as well. It's, in his case, he has Pluto in at 7 degrees of Leo, but his moon at a late degree of Cancer. So it's out of sign conjunction. And it can give somebody it's like having the moon in Scorpio. So their emotions can be quite intense. But for an artist, I think it can be quite beneficial, like for being able to kind of create. The moon is a creative force through that sense of kind of like that purging effect, but also, it can be healing, for that person as well. Mercury's trining Pluto, that can be good for regeneration of self through one's thoughts. So maybe rewiring the brain. Dr. Joe Dispenza has a book, Becoming Superhuman, and how he healed himself through the power of his mind. Well, that's what this is all about. Venus trine Pluto. So that can be very balanced for power matters, depending on how that goes. So yeah, that's what I see here. One curious thing before I go is that he had Saturn in the 6th house. If somebody has Saturn in the 6th house, they may have actually been a slave or a servant in another lifetime, because Saturn, the 6th house is the house of the servant, and Saturn can be kind of arduous labor. It can be somebody who has to work long and hard for little money sometimes. And they do it because they're very, they remember, maybe like it's just kind of like unconsciously remembering being a servant or a slave. And so it just kind of is how they view work, is that, which the 6th house is work, by the way. They view it as par for the course. But, the other thing too is that Saturn is the lord of karma. And I think that for somebody in an artistic field, it can mean that they don't just expect to sail in easily, that they expect to work for, their success. And I don't know, like I said, I don't really know a lot about his life story, but I just found that kind of curious, because the entertainment field to me is not one that I associate with a planet like Saturn, because this to me would be more like the person who's maybe is a construction worker, and they're really like working hard physically to get where they're going. And such a person can be successful because they're not afraid of hard work. They might have a very good work ethic. So that, to come to think of it, I think he was in the Air Force, if I'm not mistaken. And it was at a time, because he was born in 42. So I don't know that he was drafted. But wasn't Elvis drafted when he went into the military? I don't know how that worked in that era of the early 60s. But anyway, he was in the military. So Saturn in the 6th house could be somebody who is perfect for that type of environment where everything is regimented, because the 6th house can be your daily routine, and Saturn here can be like running this tight ship with your daily routine. But it seems so bizarre, because with all that Sagittarius energy, I would think that the person would be like, hell no, I don't want to I want to live a more open-ended life. But who knows, what wins out in terms of influences. That might be something that really was a backbone for him, because Saturn can be discipline and organization. Okay, that's what I have for you. I hope that you found this interesting, if you have stayed throughout this whole thing, because I've been talking for over 49 minutes. But you definitely get a gold star if you did. So if you would like a private reading, the link is below. Thanks for listening. Bye.